let's say like in the 90s, if you were a type 1, you'd be told by the nurses, there's an exchange system. You can have this kind of food or that kind of food. We don't have sugar. We don't have. Now the kids are encouraged. That's what insulin's for. We don't want you to change your diet. You eat like everybody else. There's even a phrase like kids first, diabetes second, they say. So what is the result? Type 1 kids were once lean. Now type 1 kids are more obese than their non-diabetic counterparts, where obesity is an epidemic levels. All of a sudden, there's this big push by pharma to medicate obesity in children out of the blue, right? Where did that come from?
Okay, good morning. Happy, what is today? Tuesday, 10th of January. Today's my birthday, just so you guys know. So anyway, thank you for happy birthday in advance. We've got Dr. Dikeman with us today. It's an honor to get to chat with him. Do you go by Dave or Richard? I'm confused. What do you prefer? What's your preferred?
It's kind of 50-50.
Okay.
So
okay.
I have different worlds, and I'm Richard David.
I see.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. So and you are, if I'm not mistaken, are you like in Hawaii or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah. Aloha.
Aloha. Well, good. Yes. Nice. Which island are you on?
I'm on the island of Oahu in the city of Honolulu on the outskirts.
Yeah. Okay. I've been there a couple of times. Really nice place. It's one of my favorite places in the U.S. for sure. It's definitely kind of a tropical paradise for sure. Well, I know we'll probably talk quite a bit about type 1 diabetes, I would imagine, today, but just tell us a little bit about your background, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, before the type 1 diabetes, it's actually interesting to the type 1 diabetes story, really, is so I grew up in Michigan. I went to the University of Michigan, and I pursued a theoretical physics Ph.D. at the University of Minnesota Theoretical Physics Institute, and worked on quantum chromodynamics with a bunch of Russian guys who had come over to the university and formed this institute during the perestroika period. We're talking, 80s, 90s. And that's sort of my background. And I had a kind of a fork in the road in maybe 1996, where I had to either decide to try to stay in academia or possibly just try something different. And, I gave a lot of talks at different universities, and I had always been kind of Hawaii in the back of my head, like a lot of people are. So I came out here and gave a talk at UH and just absolutely loved it. And I just decided to give it a shot. And I could always go to Silicon Valley or something like that if it didn't work out. And I came out, I didn't have any money. I didn't have a job. I took the city bus in on a one-way ticket. It's a long story, but I got a job. I got a girl. We got married. I have kids, and all of a sudden I'm, it's 25 years later, and here we are.
So, obviously, if you have this physics degree behind you, but you don't do that now, right? Or am I mistaken on that? Are you still doing physics stuff?
I don't do particle physics, but I'm a chief scientist at a major DoD contractor.
I see. Okay, and so the RD, what does that stand for? Because in your
Richard David.
Richard Day. Okay, I was thinking. Somebody was thinking.
So I got booted from Facebook because people said I was impersonating a registered dietitian.
That's what I was thinking too. I was like, because you're in the diet space, you're talking about that, and it was already. I just assumed it was.
Yeah.
Wow.
I had to send them a copy of my driver's license to get cleared from.
Really? They kicked you off for putting your
jail.
Initials up there. That is crazy. I mean, we live in a crazy time with all the crazy censorship and stuff like that. Well, so obviously, you've got a degree in physics. That's a challenging. So I had to take physics in college as part of my my pre-med stuff, and I took physics for physics major. And I remember it was just weird because it was like I remember the professor gave us a problem to solve. We had to go home and do it over the weekend. And he comes back later and no one could solve it. Oh yeah, I left out a variable. Sorry guys. And he's like pulling their, I'm trying to solve this damn physics problem. But anyway, so, okay, let's talk about, now you have, if I'm not mistaken, you have two children, I think. And I know at least one of them's a type 1 or maybe both of them are. I can't remember.
Yeah, I have Dave and Hayden, and Dave is in his first year pre-med at Baylor University. and he was diagnosed. So he's 19 now, and he was diagnosed 10 years ago when he was 9. Hayden is my little one. He's a junior in high school, and he's not type 1. But he is a low. We'll get to all that, I suppose.
Sure,
but he's a big time low carber water polo player and all that stuff.
Okay,
So
so you're old. He's in Waco, Texas, and Baylor, I assume. So
yeah.
And I saw you sent me a talk that he had given about glucose variability and that type of stuff, and why we have such a hard time matching glucose.
That was the younger one, yeah.
Oh, that was the youngest one. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And so he's not diabetic, but he still talked about the low carb stuff. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Both are have interned with Bernstein and do his podcast. So they're the little one is not type 1. He's still big time into the nutritional aspect. And
your oldest, what was his name again?
David.
David
is
just like you. Yeah, okay, David like you. Did he? So when was he diagnosed with type 1 diabetes?
2013.
And so how old was he at that time?
9.
And any insight into the etiology of what happened? I mean, some people think it might be a viral type of thing, or obviously autoimmune genetics. Is there any insight into what happened? Did he just get sick one day, or?
That's what we don't have any history in the family. I knew nothing about diabetes. I didn't know type 1 versus type 2. I didn't know anything about food. I was just, I'm like a normal pizza, beer drinking schlub from the Midwest. So I heard bits and pieces. Like when I was younger in college, I always made sure that I ate cereal for breakfast to make sure my cholesterol was good. That's my nutritional. That's the RD.
Got it.
Background, right? So I didn't know anything about what was going on, and to cut to the quick, that Dave's like this really good football player, good quarterback, and he always was. He was the quarterback in second grade and at recess and stuff, and he played high school and had an offer and all that stuff. But he went to Baylor, but and he doesn't play football. But anyhow, we had this island champ, 9-time champ flag football team, right? And he, for a couple of games, he was like, what was going on, dude? You just like hand the ball to the other team. It was the weirdest thing, and then the teacher told us that he was putting his head down on the desk and really tired, and then he just didn't look good. And with type 1, they just go off the cliff so fast with the weight loss and everything. So he went into DKA, as we now know. We didn't know it at the time. I told this story before, but I kept him home. We were watching the Michigan play in the final, or in the NCAA tournament, right? So we were like, well, just stay home. We'll watch the Michigan game. And he was so hungry, but they're hungry, but then they can't metabolize anything.
Yeah.
And he wanted McDonald's. So I got him McDonald's, and he threw up, and he couldn't get up off the couch, and I picked him up and I carried him into the shower. And when I picked him up, I was like, God, he's like light as a feather, and I felt his rib cage, right? And I helped him with his shirt off to get into the shower. And dude, it was like, holy shit, what the hell happened? He looked like he was going to die. So he's in the shower. I called my wife. I said, there's something wrong. Dave looks like he's going to die. Anyhow, it's it's like kind of a typical story up to that point with the type 1 diagnosis. We had talked to the pediatrician. She told us to, give him a lot of milkshakes to get his calories up so he could gain weight.
This is before or after the diagnosis of type 1?
That's before.
Okay.
Yeah. He's really hungry, but he's just going through like a gawky stage. So there's like a misdiagnosis. It's very common. Misdiagnosis. Parents don't know anything. Kid gets worse and worse, almost dies. There's a critical situation. And then they get into the endocrinologists, and they get diagnosed, and they start on insulin.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, from the time he first started losing weight till the diagnosis, how long was it? Months, a year? What do you think? When was he losing weight?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, so the football thing, right? So there's like 3 or 4 months of that kind of aberrant, you know, behavior or production or whatever, right? And then it went off the cliff. So I suppose, it could have been upon him. It happens in stages, right? So it could have been going on for a year or more. His blood sugars might have been elevated for several years. I have no idea.
Yeah, tough to say. So you fast forward, you get the diagnosis. He's in DK, probably in ER, IV insulin, hydration, all the stuff. Hey, you got a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. Here's your insulin for the rest of your life. What was obviously the nutritional advice was what? Just eat a bunch of carbs and just cover it with insulin, chase insulin all day long.
Yeah,
How was it? How
exactly. And we had a pretty decent doctor in the sense that he said I can't be too generous. He said that he said something like, as far as we know, kids have a natural protection from high blood sugars, and we don't understand it, but it's sort of a magical thing, which is absolute bullshit. But then he did tell Dave, your blood sugar, if it goes too high for too long, you'll have serious complications like eyes, amputation, an early death. And that got Dave's attention. Then he said, if you go too low, you'll have hypoglycemia. And so carbs make your blood sugar go up and insulin makes it go down. And Dave, I've told this story again, I told this story before, but Dave said, well, I just won't eat any carbs. And the reaction from me and the doctor was to laugh because, of course, Dave needs carbs for energy, right? He's a young athlete, he's growing. And that's kind of like the intro to the story. Of course, we met with the dietitian who was overweight and gave us the professional industry book, which had a lot of, pasta and cereals and chicken breast and applesauce and, the junk food that they send the kids down the tubes with. And so we took this recipe and we went home with it and we tried it. And I took off for a couple of weeks because I had to get Dave back into into shape, really. And I also look, the real cool thing about the convergence of the physics here is that, my work life has to do with real-time signal processing. So I look at sensor outputs and I develop models for, inputs and outputs, transfer functions. And so here's like the perfect example when the doctor was explaining it. You eat food, you have two control variables, and then you have an output. And I thought, yeah, these other kids might be getting A1Cs of 7 and 8, but I'm pretty smart. So we'll figure out how to cover, the cookie and all that stuff and get the flat line. So that's what we tried to do. I tried to break down meals scientifically, giving the exact amounts of carbohydrate, the exact amounts of Dave liked chocolate chip cookies, exactly, and figure out the insulin dose and then write down in my notebook what I did and then recalibrate the next day. And every day my wife would come home and I'd report like what, I'm getting closer, and then, it didn't work this day, but I think I have a new idea. We would try this. My wife, after like 2 weeks of it, was like, I don't know, man. So she's Googling like low carb, what about this low carb idea? Dave is sick of oatmeal at this point, and he's like, let's just eat eggs. I don't have to deal with this. And I thought, there's something weird going on here.
It's interesting. Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dave, but I mean, it's interesting that your young son, when he's first approached with this problem, says, "Hey, why don't I just cut down carbs?" I mean, it seems like it's just like an answer that a little kid can give, and yet we're like, well, that doesn't make sense because. Anyway, it's interesting. So go ahead. So you're trying your best to cover this, and I know I've talked to so many diabetics, and it's so hard to correct correctly when they're eating high carb. I mean, it's just up and down and up and down. So anyway, how's it go next?
Well, what I started to feel was that the system that I was trying to manage, what had it was a stochastic system that there was enough random variation in the system that control was impossible. Then, Roxanne bought the Bernstein book, and I went to get it from the mailbox, and I opened it up, And there's the section that I opened up to was the law of small numbers. Mm-hmm. And I immediately, so as a physicist, you see the word law and your ears perk up, right? And I thought, oh my God, this is exactly the phenomenon that I've been witnessing. Not only that, you look through the table of contents and you quickly realize, and I'm getting goosebumps telling this story. You realize that this guy has it all figured out. He didn't just discover the phenomenon. He discovered how to beat that phenomenon. And so in the next, half an hour or so, Shawn, I couldn't even read. I was like so excited because up to this point, you've gone through like your son's going to die, and then there's no solution to this problem. And if you look at the literature on what happens to these kids, it is a gruesome future that they have in front of them.
Yeah, let's take a second to talk about that, because I think, life expectancy of a type 1 diabetic is much lower than someone else. Obviously, all the side effects with, retinopathy, nephropathy, cardiovascular disease, on and on and on. What did you see when you were reading about that? And obviously you probably don't want to share it with your young child. Hey, you're gonna likely die shorter. What did you find out?
No, I mean, he was right at the breaking point of when you discuss that, right? So he was a 4th grader, and the doctor broke the ice. Him and the doctor had a little bit of a bond because they're going to the same school, and they're talking, and Dave is super bright. So you kind of get the feeling like he can handle little reality. And so we never sugarcoated it from him. Maybe if he was like a little older, a little younger, 1st grade or 2nd grade, we would have paused on that. But he knew right away, and I was sharing with him right away, like, hey, we got to get this problem under control. Look at this, look at that. The outcomes are the following. As you said, like I have a bunch of research slides, of course, but let's say 15 years if you're diagnosed early. But it's not just 15 years that you lose. These kids are running A1Cs of 8% on average. They come down a little bit as an adult. But there's about 100 complications of hyperglycemia. When you go to the endocrinologist, they might test for 1 or 2, or look in your kidney blood work, at which time you're already in big trouble. But every complication is horrible. Like we know now that most kids, type 1 kids, have early gastroparesis. Well, if you go onto the Facebook groups, the social media groups, and search gastroparesis and read some of the horror stories, and that's just one complication, which is an apathy of the vagus nerve. You have people that can't, they vomit when they eat, they can't digest food, they're in pain just from eating. And this is the tip of the iceberg. This is not like type 2, where you have sort of a slow onset, takes many decades. These kids that are diagnosed, they're going to have problems right away. We know now that the kids have problems with the formation of gray and white matter. The gray and white matter ratios are way off when they're little. We know if you search like type 1 child brain in the literature, there's more papers coming out every day about that topic. And that's the tip of the iceberg. There's papers that the ADA publishes on the one hand that show that the micro and macrovascular complications start as soon as blood sugars go up. But on the other hand, they pay minor lip service to low carb, and they're telling people to run these super high blood sugars.
Yeah, let's take a second to the current guidelines. Yeah. I mean, from what I've seen, their target is an A1C of 7, just under 7, and it's 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter 70% of the time. So 30% of the time you can be above that. You'd be running 200 plus, and that's the goals. I mean, it's just like your goal is to have these people die early, and have all these complications with those numbers. I mean, realistically, isn't that?
I suspect that they don't have, aside from low carb, which the former ADA CEO used. She was type 2, and she basically reversed her type 2 diabetes, as far as I know. and was showing her flatline CGM graph to other people with diabetes at conferences, and refused to eat rice and bread at lunches. I think she refused some rice, and then someone told her it was cauliflower rice. Aside from that, and she's now gone. Aside from that, they're telling people to run this time in range up to 180. And why are they doing that? I suspect that the treatments that they are pushing, which are medical and device oriented, they know they can't perform to the truly normal standards. So they soften the standards instead of try to understand how to attain truly normal blood sugars using the insulin tools we already have and dietary intervention. That's the story. We published papers in the Journal of Pediatrics about all this stuff, and not a single ADA person or a single endocrinologist has reached out and said, hey, how do you cover protein? How are you actually using basal insulin to get these results? Does it work with an insulin pump? There's been no industry interest. They just want to sweep it aside.
Yeah. It's hard, gosh, in the last few years, especially, it's hard not to get jaded and look at this and say, these people don't care. They just care about making money. And that's, in many cases, and even the physicians that, they just don't know. They have, like you said, it could be. And why was that? I can't remember her name, Tracy, I forget the name of the president, the former president of the ADA.
Brown.
Yeah, she's gone. Why is she gone? Did they not like the fact that she was low carb, or I wonder what happened, or is there just a term limit or something like that? It's just like, this is a person that's espousing maybe a dietary approach, and she's removed from her position in that place. I don't know the details behind that. Let's talk a little bit about Dr. Bernstein. I've got his book. I've read his book. I've read a bunch of books on diabetes. I've read the plant-based one just to see what's out there for contrast. And who is Dr. Bernstein? Because I think it's important to talk about who he is, because he has some insight more than most people have.
Yeah, and I got an interesting carnivore nugget for you from Bernstein that you might not have heard. But yeah, Bernstein is the book that my wife got in the diabetes solution, and I guess she got it from Googling low carb and diabetes and so on. Found him, but he's a remarkable guy. He was, and part of the reason we've developed a close friendship, Bernstein and I, was because he was originally a physicist, and he went to Columbia, was studying physics, and his classmates and lab partners went on to be physics greats that, of course, I know because that's my business. And so we when I reached out to him, and that's, I'm cutting through the story, but what happened was we took his book and we had Dave's, in about a month, we had Dave's blood sugars perfect. And I sent him the graphs, and then called him. And that's a funny story too. But anyhow, we developed kind of a friendship that wasn't just the diabetes thing, but we talk a lot of physics. And then I said, well, let's start a YouTube channel. You were diagnosed at age 12. You're 84 now. He's still practicing medicine. He gave up physics when he figured out how to control his type 1, and got a medical degree when he was 44. Wrote the book and been treating people. But I said, a lot of people don't know your message. Let's get it out there in a more modern venue in YouTube. So we started controlling running his YouTube channel, Dave and I, and then later Hayden, and put out maybe 150 videos. I wanted to catalog everything that he knew, because there was so much more than the book. And I wanted to get that information locked up somewhere. And I thought YouTube was the right way to do it.
Yeah, it's remarkable, because is he 84 right now? Is that what he's at currently?
87.
Oh, he's 87 and still alive.
Yeah.
I don't know how many type 1 diabetics make it to 87. he has to be one of
few.
Very few, right? So he's obviously,
he still goes to the gym too. So I don't think anyone's still going to the gym. Yeah,
good for him. That's inspiring. I look at, there's people like, when people ask me who I look up to, I look at these people that are doing that. They're in their 80s and 90s and still going strong and training and stuff like that. So I guess, let me end, because you mentioned there's some carnivore nugget with regard to
yeah.
So what is that? I'm interested to hear what he had to say about that.
Well, I was interested in what he thought of you or the carnivore diet back in the day. So I slipped a question into, because he does this teleseminar once a month. I slipped a question in there. He always gets questions from the mastering diabetes people about like challenges and stuff, and he never really takes it too seriously. But he does include in his recommendation vegetables, fibrous vegetables, 30 grams a day, up to 30 grams a day. And the reason he does that is because he hypothesized that there may be some value in it. He cites some literature that he saw early on where, new vitamins or whatever were being, discovered in vegetables. And he thought there may be some value in adding it. But his diet is, of course, centered around protein emphasis. And someone asked him about carnivore in one of these teleseminars, and his response was, we're still at the hypothesis level. That's all. So, his diet basically is a carnivore diet with the hypothesis that you may or may not need vegetables. And if you do, you can't have starchy underground vegetables. You can have some above ground greens.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned, because this is something, and I want to, because we've got, halfway through, and I want to make sure we get some of this information out there for type 1 diabetics that are watching, parents that have type 1 kids. Maybe they're not aware of the Type 1 Grit website, Facebook group that I think Bernstein is involved with, or some of the videos that are out there, but we'll use this opportunity. So how do we go about dosing? Obviously, as most people understand, type 1 diabetes, once you got it, it's not going away. You're not curing it. I have seen anecdotes of a few people saying they've come off insulin. Maybe they weren't properly diagnosed. Maybe they're in the honeymoon phase, something like that. There's some literature that says even long-term type 1 diabetics still have some residual beta cell function. It's still there. Maybe they'll be able to figure out it. They always hear about the beta cells are dead. I think what we see is that they're basically de-differentiating into non-insulin secreting, they lose some of the insulin secreting capacity. Could that be a reverse one day? Who knows? But with the assumption that you got this, you got it for life, you're always going to be insulin. How do we, like, let's say you're on a carnivore diet or a very low carb diet. How do you dose? What are you guys doing for dosing?
So the first question about the honeymoon, Dave gave a talk at Harvard about all his experience, and we did a few polls in the type 1 grit group to get beyond we wrote this paper that was published in Pediatrics, which demonstrated unprecedented glycemic control, excellent lipids and so on. But we didn't touch the honeymoon aspect. So I did a poll in type 1 grit, and there's a substantial number of people who've had honeymoons where they've used no insulin up to 1 year. Maybe 15-20% of people are honeymooning with no insulin up to a year or over a year. And then some people see a gradual increase. About a quarter of the people saw a gradual increase. And then, of course, there are a lot of people that never had a honeymoon. Dave never had a honeymoon. I suspect that the high glucose existed for so long, and other physiologic factors, he just burned himself out. And so anyhow, that honeymoon aspect or extended honeymoon aspect is quite common. It's nothing that raises the eyebrow. You'll have kids that use 1 or 2 units of insulin or diluted insulin. But how do you cover is interesting. So on the one hand, you have the established professional industry guidelines, which say you count carbs and you dose rapid acting insulin, paying no attention to protein as a free food. On the other hand, you have known biochemistry and physiology, which correctly explains why eating protein foods provoke the secretion of insulin. And this is one thing I happened to learn early on, and I did not understand why this is such a mystery to people in endocrinology. In fact, Bernstein's whole book, in some sense, revolves around the idea of how to use insulin to cover protein foods. Yet if you asked 100 endocrinologists, does protein require insulin injection? Maybe 99 would say no. And one would say, that's, something that's mysterious and we just don't know about right yet. So that was a tip off to me that we're being given advice that people have no idea about, because all these facts are in the Bernstein book that you're not told about. So then, you have to then understand, like, well, okay, so how does he control blood sugar if, low carb? What's the physics of what he's doing? As I explained that this oatmeal and rapid acting insulin was giving me a stochastic result. How come Bernstein thwarts that? And the reason that works is that, and he explained it to me, you've got carbohydrate with this sharp peak and rapid acting analog insulins with this sharp peak. And you're trying to match these two peaks up. And there's enough variability in the system via digestion and how insulin is absorbed that you cannot hit them. It's like trying to shoot a target from far away with someone on your shoulders, or it's like trying to drive down the road with your eyes closed, for 10 seconds, opening them up. You don't have enough feedback in your system to control that. And the variability is the result. And that's what I understood early. Now, why does Bernstein's dosing prescriptions thwart that? The reason why is that protein slowly provokes the secretion of insulin over many hours. And he uses an intermediate acting insulin, regular, which acts over 6 to 8 hours. And so now, instead of matching these sharp peaks, it's like equivalent to moving right up to the target. You've got this long, narrow, fat peak and another long, narrow. So if Dave eats a steak and then he's done and I go, dude, you forgot to give yourself insulin. He'd go, oh, crap. And then he'll give himself some insulin and it'll be fine, because there's no sensitivity when you mismatch these peaks. So it's a physics-based reason why this all works. Once you overcome that variability, the variability of meals, then all the other variabilities like exercise and things like that, growth, all those things can be overcome. But if you add enough variability from carbohydrate, and it looks like the threshold for that stochastic phase transition is right around 40 grams, 30, 40, 50 grams. We showed that in the pediatrics paper. If you add that variability from carbohydrate just a little bit, you lose control of your system.
Is that 30, 40 grams per day or per meal?
Per day.
Per day.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it depends the type of, because we're talking about the peaks, right? So that if you're eating carbohydrate that's rapid acting, potatoes, rice, flours, you're in trouble. But if you eat something which is very slow acting, greens, then, that glycemic profile looks a lot like protein food. So again, you can cover it with regular. So if you can get normal blood sugars and there may be a reason to have some vegetables, then Bernstein said, okay, I'm going to include them. Not required, but okay, as long, but he'll say, well, you can't eat berries because there's enough glycemia in berries. There's enough profile, and that's kind of like right on the border to give you a feel where you would lose control if you ate too many berries. One strawberry is not going to kill you.
Yeah. Is there any, because some people will say you can, obviously we'll talk about basal, I guess, here in a second, but some people will say they're going to keep some rapid acting insulin available just in case they have to correct, because it's a
right.
correcting. Is that part of the scheme as well?
Correct. So now let's suppose you're off on your calibration. Okay. Like, here's a typical situation. It's Sunday. We're having a steak dinner. Dave normally boluses 10 units of regular for a 22-ounce steak. Okay. But Dave didn't exercise today. So his insulin sensitivity is a little bit lower than normal because he doesn't practice on Sundays. So guess what happens? There's not enough basal to cover basal's kind of covering the fat in the meal. So that's the kind of ball game so now what do? He starts to, after 3 hours, he's like 110 or 115. What do you do? Well, you want to bring him down. So you want to use fast insulin there. But the beauty of the Bernstein thing is if you're off just a little bit, you don't have to use a big dose of insulin to bring him down. So a unit right in the muscle of rapid acting is going to work twice as fast. And that typically does the trick. And if he goes too far down, you give him a little glucose. So that's this balancing game, but it's not like you're life, death, life, death, life, death. It's this kind of nudging that occurs, and the control is you have fine control rather than this,
Yeah, that's in a contrast to somebody that might eat a lot of carbs and they misdiagnose, or they misdose themselves, and then now they're looking at a blood glucose of 240, 280. So then they slam in some more insulin, and now they overcorrect, and now they're in the 40s and they're hypoglycemic, and so they immediately start shoveling anything sugary they can possibly get, because they feel awful, and then they overcorrect that. Now they're back over at 180, and it's just a it's like riding a crazy surf type thing. I know there's a book out there called Sugar Surfing. I can't remember who wrote that book, but that's another one where they kind of talk about. Is Dave wearing a CGM? Have you found any?
Yeah, Dave. That's kind of like, you can't beat it, right? You have to. The sugar surfing people. But if you look at the people who are sugar surfing, they're all out of control. So there's and then I've seen him post pictures where his blood sugar's flat. Took a picture of all this stuff. Oh, he ate low carb that day. And then I saw someone challenge him to eat, French fries and all that. And his blood sugar went up to 200 or 250, and he had 30 units or 20 units of rapid acting insulin in him at midnight. And the life experience of someone, like if Dave goes to bed after eating a steak, and he'll have a few units of regular on board, but a lot of these kids are going to bed with 20, 30 units of rapid acting insulin on board. And the parents feel like, the kid has to have the cake, and we're going to make sure that he eats normal, like all the other obese kids. And they overwhelm these kids with so much insulin. So it's like a disaster. So the difference between what's happening with Dave and other kids to follow this, and the general population, which is following the diabetes industry protocols, is astonishing in terms of not just their future outcomes, but their day-to-day quality of life.
Outside of the uncontrolled, rapid vacillating swings in blood sugar, which is just miserable in experience. I mean, I'm told it, you go from feeling awful hyperglycemic, then you feel even worse hypoglycemic, and you're back and forth with that. Is there any other downside to using lots of insulin? If you're using, let's say you're using, 40 units a day versus someone that's using 150. What is the downside of just insulin alone? Is there anything that you're aware of?
You can speculate, but what we know now in the type 1, in the last 10 years, what's happened is, let's say like in the 90s, if you were a type 1 and you're a kid, the parents, you'd be told by the nurses, there's an exchange system. You can have this kind of food or that kind of food. We don't have sugar. Now the kids are encouraged. That's what insulin's for. You don't have to, we don't want you to change your diet. You eat like everybody else. If you don't eat these processed goods, you're going to have a bad relationship with food. You're going to hate your kids are going to hate you. They tell the parents. The kids are one day, then they're going to hate their parents. They're going to go off and sneak foods. They won't be able to live a normal life. And so what is the result? The result is, there's even a phrase like cake first, diabetes second, or kids first, diabetes second, they say. So what is the result? The obesity, so type 1 kids were once lean. Now, type 1 kids are more obese than their non-diabetic counterparts, where obesity is an epidemic levels. So the clinicians can't even tell when these kids come in if they've got type 1 or type 2. It's like astonishing. And you saw yesterday, or the last few days, now they're, all of a sudden there's this big push by pharma to medicate obesity in children. Yeah, out of the blue, right? Where did that come from?
Well, it's definitely going to make them some money. But I mean, and I don't know if you're aware of it, there was a study out there recently that looked at cancer rates in type 1 diabetics, and those that were in the high insulin utilization group had higher rates of cancer than those in the low. And I think the cutoff was 0.5 units per kilogram. So if you're 100 kilograms using 50 units or less a day was considered low risk for cancer. And then if you're up closer to, 8, I think it was 0.5.
Can't be good.
Yeah. So it's higher. So you higher cancer, which makes sense. I mean, you think about it.
Cancer is also at in non-diabetic levels, 5.0 and up, you see signals for it going up. So, whether it's the hyperglycemia or the insulin, that's a fun physiologic fact story. But with the Bernstein case and what we've showed in pediatrics, and is the overwhelming experience by everybody, is your insulin levels go way down. And that's probably the thing you got to be most careful of when you switch over. Your insulin level is going to almost for sure go down, and your blood sugar is going to be normalized. So which one made you healthy? Probably both. But the complications from hyperglycemia come on pretty fast if you start looking at the literature. So, I guess it's a win-win, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, when we look at that hyperglycemia, peripheral neuropathy, gastroparesis, small vessel disease, retinopathy, nephropathy, all that stuff. I mean, it's just an absolute nightmare. And then all these other things you don't really hear about. Visual changes, whatever. I mean, probably everything. Probably it's probably
frozen shoulder.
Yeah, all the orthopedic stuff. I'm sure it's fair to say that every single system in your body will be affected negatively by diabetes. There's not a single thing you can think about. Yeah, your brain, your heart, your lungs, your reproductive system, everything is affected negatively.
It's funny. I post a lot about all this stuff on Type 1 Grit. Imagine, like, if you're a parent of a boy and you hear about the brain structure, and these are published in major journals, or you hear about impotence, ED, from high A1C, you would think, and then all you have to do is basically get rid of the junk food to avoid these problems. You would think that, and it's always been a puzzle to me, why is there less? And then I started to listen to Joan Ifland. I don't know how to pronounce the last name. And she brought up the UPF food addiction stuff. And I said to her, I don't think you can come up with a better example of how intensely addictive the processed food is than with Type 1 parents who refuse to take away those foods from the family, even though they can see the result on their meters and know what the outcomes are going to be. So that's like one little takeaway that I have, is that's probably a root cause. Of course, you can't blame anyone because they've never been given the right training or the right education. They've been thrown off the track multiple times in their diabetes journey by the industry. But there's also this, of course, we realized right away that when Dave switches, I have to switch. I was fat and we all had to switch. So I switched right away. But I used to go to spin class and then I'd go to Starbucks and have a chocolate chip cookie. And I quit the cookie, but I would get the coffee still. That cookie was like calling my name when I was standing in front of that. And it made me, I laughed. I thought, God damn, this stuff is really addictive, right? I'm conflicted. There's voices in my head trying to convince me to eat the cookie, right? The situation stinks from every direction. You have to, you get the wrong training. The food that you've been told to eat, you've become comfortable with is, turning you into a addicted, obesogenic parent, on and on and on, the problems.
Well, let's just contrast, because what the average Type 1 diabetic runs a hemoglobin A1C about 8.3 or something like that. I can't remember what the number is, somewhere in there. What are these Type 1 Grit kiddos doing in adults that continue into that point? Where do they tend to run?
They're running the same. I would say that they're running the same blood sugars as non-diabetics, but I'm concerned about the non-diabetic kids who are, in mass developing Type 2 right now. Mm-hmm. So most of the Type 1 Grit kids are probably as healthy as any of their healthy non-diabetic counterparts. And I'm talking average blood sugars on their CGM 90 days around 85, 87, 83, 92, 100. If you see one of these parents who's got an average blood sugar around 102, they'll say, I have work to do. Yeah. We have to switch to regular. We're still using the wrong kind of insulin or something. So your blood sugar is going to be, if you follow the rules, and the rules are pretty clear. There's a lot of videos on it, and it's in the book, and a lot of people now know them and are helping other people. If you follow the rules, your blood sugar is going to be just the same as a healthy non-diabetic. So not the average of 200 or 220 like you're talking about with that A1C of 8.3, but an A1C of below 5.0%. Dave's always been below 5.0%. Even in college, he went away. His average blood sugar never got above 100.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, and let's talk about, because he was an athlete. I'm assuming still training, lifting, eating a lot of food. I mean, I'm just thinking about what I got to eat to maintain what I do. I eat a hell of a lot of food. I'm eating, 300 grams of protein a day, something like that. So, I mean, if you get somebody like that, they're not sick. They don't want to be sick. They want to be strong and robust, and they want to eat, a pound of steak in a meal or 2 pounds of steak in a meal or whatever it might be. How are those guys going to deal with this stuff? I mean, what is the dosing like? Let's say you eat, I think Bernstein is every 2 or 3 ounces is a unit of regular, something like that. What is the deal on that?
Yeah, you're probably eating, you might be eating what Dave was eating when he was a growing teenager in season, because, especially when football and basketball overlap during that one period, right? So you're training 3 or 4 hours a day. So it's a constant feed fest, right? So I'm buying those big Costco loaves of ribeyes and New York strips, once every other day. That's what we're going through. During season, it's there's a lot of cooking to be done, right? But in general, the Bernstein rule is 1 ounce of regular, if you're not honeymooning, for 2 ounces of protein. So 22-ounce steak at a sitting is a pretty good chunk of food. And that's about 10 units of regular.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's a non-issue. We saw a kid on social media the other day. His parents were, he was probably an 8-year-old, and his parents were like, take that diabetes. And he was eating chocolate donuts with 2 spoons, and the parent had 31 units of rapid insulin in him, which is like, death is on the table, because that's so much insulin. It's totally unpredictable. So he went high later. It's nothing like, eating a steak and taking 10 units of rapid. There's just no comparison. The lows occur so slowly, like Dave will be playing Xbox on the couch. And it's like, Dave, you're 75. And then 15 minutes later, Dave, you're 72. And then he'll kind of walk over and, get a half a glucose tab, and then he'll be back up to 82 or something. It's just totally different experience.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a thing that, because most endocrinologists treating diabetes or even primary care, they're terrified of hypoglycemia. I mean, and this is they'd rather you run high, because we don't want the lows, because obviously the acute we don't want you going into a diabetic coma. You don't want to there's some thought that chronic lows are associated with dementia, things like that. So they say, well, we're going to cheat on the high side and predispose you to blindness and amputations and heart disease and on and on and on. But
exactly right.
It's interesting. You look at like the work of like Newberg back in the 1920s, treating type 1s with basically low carb diets, and they had very little incidence of hypoglycemia despite the lack of carbs. Why do you think that is?
Well, if you're still making some insulin, then you probably have enough communication with the alpha and beta cells that you could get a glucagon response to hypoglycemia. So that may help you. But in general, and I can't comment on the system in the 20s, but in general, with the modern systems, the amount of insulin and how slow it's acting with the regular is such that you can overcome the downward trajectory of the glucose of the blood glucose with liquid glucose, or even dry tabs. So what does that look like practically? We have a sugar bowl with dextrose, and I have a spoon in the sugar bowl, which at level is 3 grams. Dave's body weight, there's a chart in Bernstein's book. Dave's body weight will raise him 4 points, 4 milligrams per deciliter per gram. So if he has 1 scoop, that's 12 points. So let's suppose Dave was 60. What would he do? Well, to get back to target, and he was dropping, maybe we'd try to target like 90. That's 30 points. Okay. So you do the math and you say, okay, that's like 2.5 scoops. And that's a conversation that occurs all the time in my house. Like, Mom, I need a scoop. How many? 2. Okay. we'll get you this, we'll get you the blood sugar. So there's still this 24, this is not a cure. We're on the ball 24/7. Dave has to wake up at night and take glucose or take insulin very frequently. So you still have to be, less so, but you still have to be on the ball. But imagine being on the ball 24/7, but losing all the time. How depressing that life would be. I'm constantly struggling with my diabetes, and now I've got gastroparesis. I can't get my blood sugar under control. Of course. And then they stand back and they go, why are these people depressed en masse? We have to treat the depression. And it's like, well, guess what happens if you normalize your blood sugar? Your depression drops to non-diabetic levels.
Yeah.
But then they'll turn around and say, well, you'll be too depressed if you don't eat processed food. I mean, it isn't the world of I could talk to you for hours, Shawn, about the stories. It is a madhouse with the doctors, the industry, the professional charities. We went to Dave was a JDRF Children's Congress rep from Hawaii. You should see the food that they give the kids. They give the kids all this food. We sat at a table with 2 and 3-year-old type 1 diabetics. You wouldn't believe how much carbohydrate these kids are eating that was available to them. And sure enough, about a half an hour into the presentation, you've got a ballroom full of 400 or 500 children with all their parents. The symphony of CGM alarms going off from high blood sugars was nauseating. And I think, Dave and I still have kind of like a PTSD. I mean, we still talk about that. This was almost 8 years ago we went there, but it was just the carnage that we saw and the future that you knew that these kids would have. It was astonishing. The advice that they were given, astonishing.
That's amazing. Let me ask you this one thing, because you mentioned, dealing with this all day long. Now the CGM makes it a little easier. It gives you clues. Hey, you're going up. You can correct real quick.
A lot easier, yeah.
And avoid some of the the big corrections you need later. But sleeping is challenging because you go to bed and you're asleep. I mean, so is there a prophylactic way to make the night better? Does he dose him with some regular overnight for a slow? I mean, or is the basal enough? I guess we didn't really touch on basal, but how does he do his basal? What is that based on? Is it just pure weight, or is it
The dosing of the basal is trial and error. It depends a lot on the type of basal insulin that you're using. So Dave was on Levemir, which is a shorter acting basal insulin, and he used 3 shots of Levemir a day. He's now on Tresiba, he uses 1 shot a day. We found that the action of Tresiba works well in the sense that if I give it to him in the morning, or he takes it in the morning, because I'm talking like the long-term caregiver. He takes it in the morning, and then what'll happen is it'll go 24 hours, and then I'll start to see it wear off around 4 a.m. If he goes low around 3 or 4 a.m., he'll take that Tresiba dose, which is now about 20 units, and subtract 1. If he goes high around 4 a.m., he'll add 1. So we've got this nice little trial and error pivot point that we've discovered. And we had our own different pivot points with Levemir. But these are the mysteries that you can unravel once you get rid of the carbohydrate in your meal. So anyway, but it doesn't really. And now if you exercise, what if he plays pickup basketball one day? He's going to be more insulin sensitive. So he might recognize that and have some food like some macadamia nuts before dinner or before bed or something like that, right? And that'll kind of keep him up. But you still have to check. There's really no way around it. He cannot go to bed at 10 p.m. and wake up at 6 with the same blood sugar he went to bed at. It doesn't work that way. And it does work that way if you run yourself at 200. And that doctors will tell the parents, you're going to get burned out. Just run him high so you can get some sleep. And they told us that. And I thought, God damn, dude, over my fucking dead body, am I going to let my kid run? I'll just work different hours and stay up but it really isn't that big a deal. You put a loaded syringe of corrective insulin and you put the sugar bowl next to the bed with some water. You check his blood sugar around 2 or 3. If it needs correcting, I'm like a NASA pit crew changing tires, man. I can get in and out. Plus I work out, you know, if you work out, you drink a lot of water, you got to pee in the middle of the night. So there's just no excuse for not taking care of your kid. You'll never regret having to wake up goddamn once in the middle of the night to make sure your kid's blood sugar is safe and normal. So, well, now he's in college. So with the CGM, I could watch him, and we're in a time differential. So it's kind of nice. So I just call him and I say, Dave, wake up. And he'll say, be asleep. I'll say, yeah, take some glucose or take some insulin. Okay. Yeah. So it's 24/7, but the habit becomes more like brushing your teeth. It doesn't feel like your kid's dying in slow motion right in front of you over a period of years. It feels like a little bit tedious, but you get used to it. How about that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's kind of interesting because unfortunately, you've got this lifelong disease. You know, it's horrible. You wish no one to have it on, but in a way, it kind of, if you manage it right, it directs you into a very healthy lifestyle. I mean, it's kind of like, it's like,
oh yeah,
as long as I stay and do the right things and be healthy and exercise and eat well, and I'm going to have a lot better chance managing this, and this kind of forces my hand a little bit. It's like it's almost I want to call it a blessing, but
we live in Hawaii. These boys go to the beach with their shirts off, and they look, like my youngest son. He's in water polo. He's tan. He doesn't eat anything different than we eat. I mean, the dude looks I wish I would have looked like that when I was younger, but I was too stupid eating the damn total cereal, thinking that I was doing the right thing. He eats eggs and beef.
Yeah.
And he looks like a Greek god. And he just turned 16. It's just, the sky is the limit. They look good. They're strong. They're both athletic people. They have an advantage over. I took my youngest son, Hayden, to a swim meet, and they were feeding the kids before the race Doritos and grapes, little things to give them a little. Yeah, and he kicked everyone's ass. And it's just like you said, it's just a total advantage to live this way. You're going to look better. You're going to feel better. Of course, you're type 1. It's like mandatory. It's essential. But, the other benefits, and I should show you a before after picture of me. I'll post it on Twitter and tag you. Yeah. I was like 260 pounds, man. I went on this diet because I love my kid. And I'm like a jackhammer now, with, I have some disc issues and blah, 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 but way more healthy than I was 20 years ago. It's absurd.
Yeah, I'm 260 right now. I mean, it's just kind of like I'm just laughing about.
You're taller than me.
Yeah,
I'm only 6'4".
Yeah, I know it. Well, but anyway, it's well, Dave, this has been awesome. What is there anything else? I mean, I want to, because this is such important information that we need to get out to all these people. What else are people missing? Anything else you want to share about your sons or type 1 diabetes in general? Whether it's kids or adults.
Well, I think that. I mean, we made a lot of, I guess the resources would be a good thing, because if we get people to watch this interview who are on the fence, we should give them some breadcrumbs. So let me give a few resources.
Maybe not breadcrumbs. Maybe steak crumb, beef jerky.
Yeah, that's a terrible
analogy.
We need a new one. So there's the Type 1 Grit page on Facebook. That's got a lot of, we post a lot of people's experiences, and we post a lot of the scientific literature, which to me, again, it's bizarre. You've got the practitioners on the one hand telling people to run high and fill your plate with starch, but then they also publishing journal articles, which should alarm you if you're getting the results that they're prescribing. But it's bizarre. So we publish in a lot of literature and links to that literature, trying to point people in the right direction. Then there's the Diabetes University YouTube page. That's
Bernstein stuff.
Yeah. And then, the Bernstein stuff is not always completely practical, because it's tough to see how. So what we do is we worked with, Dave's published some literature with Westman and Dr. Eric Westman. And Dr. Eric Westman has Adapt Academy. So he invited Dave to make a course on type 1 diabetes. And we've touched on some of the little details, and you can see that there's besides the low carb, there's a lot to it. and Dave and myself and my wife Roxanne, who's a psychologist, we cover the whole in the class, like $100. We cover everything, how to do everything. Dave talks about how you do high school athletics. My wife talks about how you do, how do you get the whole family on board from a psychology perspective. I talk about the physics. Even my youngest son, he did a talk on why low carb works, where he fleshed out a lot of the physics that we're talking about with the peaks. And now he's done research which shows why. This is one last little tidbit that I wanted to mention. There's this new technology called CGM automated loops, where you've got the CGM and the pump working together to keep your blood sugar regulated. But the people who are pushing these systems, they can't control their blood sugar. Their blood sugars are out of control still. And they're claiming success because they've got some minor improvements. But there are people in type 1 grit using these systems, and they're getting flat sugars. And so what my youngest son has done with his computer modeling is actually built expert systems into his models that show exactly the same results. That if you eat high carb foods with these profiles, it's impossible to control blood sugars. There's too much latency in the system with injected insulin to keep up and to correct. And then you have to be careful because you'll overshoot, if you give too much insulin. But with the low carb physics, so it's like a physics-based nutritional solution to type 1. And with automated systems, you can get close to saying, look, we have a sort of a mechanical cure in some sense, right? Because all this little manini stuff we have to do with Dave to keep his blood sugar under control, if it was automated, you wouldn't have to do that. Now, there's a lot of fiddling with the automation that's still taking place, but that can be improved. And you have to always be careful with insulin and stuff. But people are using these devices and getting flat blood sugars if they eat low carb. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because, it's almost as like, with this automated, CGM sensor with a pump built in, it's almost like you have a pancreas again. You got a functioning pancreas more or less. And you think about people that are not diabetic and what their pancreas is having to do, the hoops is supposed to jump through with the beta cells and the alpha cells constantly going back and forth. And you're wondering, is that good for a human over the long term? Now you have some non-diabetic athletes that eat higher carbs and they seem to be doing pretty well. But the average person, we look at the average person today and everybody's fat, everybody's obese, everybody's whatever. They got all kinds of health issues and they probably are, they're at least they're stressing out their pancreas. They're probably running hyperinsulinemic, as we know. There's a lot of lessons that we can learn from these type 1 diabetics.
Yes.
And extrapolate it to the quote unquote healthy population, or I don't even know if I want to call them healthy, but the average population, which is not healthy. So it's fascinating to see that where that goes.
Unfortunately, those systems that we're talking about, which they're being pushed as, you can relieve the burden, sort of ignore your condition, and without a dietary emphasis, you've got a machine that's going to plug you with shitloads of insulin while you go off. And so, your blood sugar is still not going to be controlled and you're going to become a fat type 2 on top of it. You're going to have double diabetes, which is like, if I asked you 10 years ago, what's double diabetes? You'd be like, I don't know. Right. But now it's commonplace.
Yeah.
So
they're taking so much insulin that they become more insulin resistant, and then it just snowballs, and you got to take more because you're insulin resistant.
Huge doses. Yeah. It's unbelievable. Yeah,
it's amazing. And you touched on this. The American Academy of Pediatrics now recommendation for putting 12-year-old kids that are obese on Wegovy and some of these other GLP-1 agonists, and it's the same thing. They're still eating crap. Just take an injection. You can still eat your crap. They give lip service. What they do is intensive diet and nutrition, but then they never follow up on that. What does that mean? Eat the food pyramid, which no one can do. No one does. No one, it's just.
Yeah. Until they emphasize protein foods, it's total lip service, and they won't do it. They'll give you the dry chicken breast. But the right advice for a type 1 parent, or a type 1 anyway, is to make your meals almost or entirely emphasized on protein foods.
Yeah.
If you do that, you can control your blood sugar and you're going to thrive. But this idea that you should still be dividing your plate up and watching your saturated fat, it is the dumbest idea in the history of nutrition. And if you're a type 1 diabetic, it's going to kill you.
Yeah, that's a fair statement. I think that's good to see. There's something called the Warsaw formula, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It talks about dosing for not only just protein and fat. Do you have any concerns about fat dosing for fat, or is that just a free, we don't care about fat?
So those kind of formulas never work. They don't work for a lot of reasons, but the main reason is if you include rapid acting carbohydrate in your meal, then you lose control. You go back to, it's a phase transition back to this stochastic system. So, that kind of formula is never going to work. Is the kind of idea that gets supplanted in physics by the correct idea. Unfortunately, with this, in this field, there's no feedback mechanisms amongst the practitioners to overcome this inertia that exists. With basal insulin, what you can see is that because the insulin that's provoked by dietary fat is so small and occurs over such a long period that you can't use even this longer intermediate acting insulin to cover it. What you can do is use different basal doses. And I'll give you a great example. If let's suppose that Dave comes home and he's like, oh, we had a unexpected basketball practice and we ran suicides for like 2 hours and I had a light lunch. It's going to be hard for me to get enough dinner into his belly to cover that insulin sensitivity. And I've already dosed his basal dose. So I've already made the decision to dose his metabolic profile for that day based on the fact that he wasn't going to do this suicide drills or have a light lunch. So now what do? If I don't do anything at dinner time, he's going to go low at night because that basal insulin that's still on board is going to be working in his system when he's still insulin sensitive. So what I do is I make a recovery shake, which consists of about 400 or 500 calories of heavy cream. And that insulin that's free in his system, and that's all like, if you think about it, it's like how lipogenesis works. That insulin that's in the system will be supported by that saturated fat from the heavy cream shake. And that works like a charm. And so typically what we've always done in athletic seasons is he comes home and I say, have you worked out hard, medium, or not at all today? And I'll gauge his recovery shake based on that. So dietary fat lives in the basal. That's the signal that you see. And this is, again, one of those things that you won't notice if you're on the roller coaster from carbohydrates. You'll never detect such a signal. But if you are living in this low carb world where everything you do, if Dave wakes up and he's 83 and he does 50 push-ups, I'll see his blood sugar go up, right? Because of the adrenaline response from doing that heavy lifting or whatever. So anyhow, yeah, dietary fat, we see it in the basal signal, right? If you go on a diet or you fast, what happens? You stop your dietary and you're low carb, you're not taking any fat. What happens? Your insulin level goes down, right? And then that's kind of how it works. Yeah.
Well, fascinating stuff. Dave, thank you so much for doing this. Like I said, I hope more people will, at least look into what you're doing. And maybe get some information from this interview, but more importantly, go check out the resources you guys have, because it's life or death. Like you said, they're literally killing people with their dietary recommendations. And, it introduces such a level of complexity into managing the disease, which could otherwise be actually manageable. Whereas the high carb kids, they're not managing their disease. There's no way they are. They're just have a poor quality of life. So where do we go to find this information again? Can you just kind of outline the websites and stuff?
Yeah, go to, so I'll give you 3. I'll give you 4. There's a great page on Facebook called Let Me Be 83. That's a mom who chronicles her son, who's a world-class tennis player.
83 is the blood sugar. 83 is the blood sugar to goal, I guess. Is that right?
Yes,
yeah,
yes, okay. That's the Bernstein number.
Yeah.
She has a documentary called The Diabetes Solution. You can find it on Vudu or YouTube. and we're in it, and it's, Bernstein's in it. It's unbelievable. The Type 1 Grit Facebook page. If you want to take a class, which is, will take you from novice to expert on this stuff, it's the Adapt Academy with Dr. Eric Westman, and then Diabetes University with Bernstein. If you want to know every single detail, I see a question in the comment about what are my strategies for gastroparesis? Well, that's why we made the Bernstein stuff. Bernstein knows how to treat gastroparesis. It's one of the apathies. You can reverse it. It's one of the harder things to reverse, but there's a video at Diabetes University on gastroparesis, and I'm not a practitioner, so I don't. Of course, Bernstein's he's up in the rarefied air with Einstein on this stuff, right? So I'm just in some sense, I'm just a dad who's applying his principles, right? So those are the tiers of information that you can get.
I wonder if Dr. Bernstein does interviews. It'd be fun to interview him sometime. I don't know if he's interested in that stuff at his age of 87 or whatever, but that'd be fun sometimes.
Absolutely. Let's do it. I'll hook you up with him.
That'd be wonderful.
And,
that'd be great.
Yeah, you'll be astonished after you talk to him, because if you close your eyes, it'll feel like you're talking to a 30-year-old grad student with an IQ of 150. There's no elderly in that guy's intellect.
Wow, wonderful.
Yeah,
awesome. Dave, have a great day. Thank you so much. Keep up the good work. I look forward to continuing to see what you guys do. And you're both your sons, but first, certainly good luck with his medical school. If he's pre-med and getting into medical school and making a difference there. We need more people like that. Definitely we can change. I think, the interesting thing that I think is, it's like we have a group of people that are affected by this disease that are probably doing more to advance the knowledge and actually help people than the entire pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare system, which is sad commentary, but I think that's the realistic commentary for sure.
Yeah, I'm passionate about getting the message out, so I appreciate you having me on board.
Absolutely.
I think you can feel the passion. I'm trying to talk as fast as possible to get as much information in as I can.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Thank you so much. Everybody else, have a great day. I'm going to go eat some, I got a prime rib I'm celebrating. So anyway, we'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye now. Take care, everybody.
All right.